of our community, Temple Ner Tamid, and has been a member there since she got back to the United States and raising her family in the community. And we're privileged not only to have her in the community, but to be hosting this conversation today. Now, Mohammed. So Mohammed Darwashe is the director of the Center of Equality and Shared Society at Givat Haviva. Mohammed's been is a leading political analyst and expert on Jewish-Arab relations within Israel. He's been the director and Center of Equality and Shared Society since January 2014, but he also served in 2000 to 2005. A nonprofit which is dedicated to strengthening relations and promoting civic equality between Israel's Jewish and Arab citizens. He served as a member of the three-sector roundtable and on the strategic planning team of the Authority for Economic Development of the Arab Sector, both at the Prime Minister's office. He is also a research fellow at the Hartman Institute and at the Robert Bosch Academy. And so I'm sure he's going to tell you much more about himself, his work with the National Committee, drafting the coexisting education policy in 2009, and any number of other things. He frequently appears all over the news, and we are so glad to have him here today. So I'm going to spotlight both him and Jody's video. And so if you want the best viewing experience, I'll invite you to go into your speaker view so you can see them. I will also be making this transcript available for everyone, closed caption, in case that you want to hear what they have to say. And so without further ado, I want to welcome the two of them to the screen.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Katz, and thanks everybody for being with us on a Sunday morning. It's really exciting for me to kind of bring together my two big Jewish communities, the Forward and Temple Ner Tamid, together. And I really appreciate everybody joining us. And we're so thrilled to have Mohammed calling in from Iksal, a village in Israel, where his family dates back many years. We'll talk about that in a bit. I want to thank Larry Westrike for organizing this and having this as a brainstorm, and Dina Cooperman of our staff at the Forward for helping put it together, along with Rabbi Katz. And before I start, I just want to acknowledge it's almost a year since the death of Freddie Pressman, a beloved Temple Ner Tamid member who really inspired, I think, a new level of Israel programming and discussions at Ner Tamid. And I put on my Hineni pin this morning in memory of Freddie, who was the sort of embodiment of the Hineni concept of showing up, of being there. And I really appreciate all of you showing up this morning for this conversation. We have the chat function available, I think, to everybody. And if you have questions or comments as we go, please share them in the chat. I will turn to some of your questions when and if I run out of my own. No, obviously to just join my own. There's a million different things to talk about with Mohammed, who's such an interesting figure in Israel, in Israeli politics, in Palestinian relations, and in the whole concept of thinking about what the future of Israel and Israel's relationship with the Palestinians really can be and is now. So Mohammed, I want to start off by talking about politics, the recent Israeli elections. You know, in my bio, Mark mentioned that I covered 2 elections over my 4 years in Jerusalem for the New York Times, which seemed like a lot at the time, 2 elections in 2 years, but now it's sort of a joke. We've had 4 elections in 2 years. It seems like we might be heading now to a 5th, as there's no clear path to a coalition. You created this spring, early this year, a new political party called Ma'an, which is Arabic for the word together, or Yachad in Hebrew. You were poised to participate in last month's election, although a couple weeks before the election, you did disband, realizing that your party was not going to meet the threshold. So tell us a little bit about why you formed the party and why it didn't work, what you think happened this time.
Well, thank you, Jody, for having me, and also thanks to Rabbi Katz and to Larry. And I also want to mention Doron from our New York office, Givat Haviva's New York office. Maybe together also I see a couple of other friends from a couple of board members, Robert and Isabel. It's good to see some friends in this wonderful crowd that we have this Sunday morning, your time, afternoon, my time. Actually, the idea of forming Ma'an together was an idea. Initially, we thought of forming a Jewish-Arab joint party that will go as a balanced, sorry, as a balanced party that every second person would be Arab or would be Jewish, thinking that Israeli politics, specifically Jewish Arab politics, need to change. Trying to reflect what is happening on what I would call islands of success in Jewish Arab relations, such as in the medical industry. If you go to hospitals, you would see that Jewish Arab relations actually work. If you go to universities, you'll see that almost 19% of Israeli university students are Arab. If you look at the high-tech industry, a significant increase of Arab employees are moving into the high-tech industry. And we thought to try to reflect this kind of dynamics, the dynamics of success in Jewish-Arab relations, to try to reflect it politically. And we engaged in, I would say, even 6 months dialogue with some Jewish counterparts. And unfortunately, in this discourse, we couldn't find, especially because of the crowdedness, it was very crowded in the Jewish left. There are so many parties. You know, you take Meretz, you take Labour Party, you take Benny Gantz, you take Yair Lapid, and then it was Kholdai from the mayor of Tel Aviv. There were too many fragments in the Jewish center left that pretty much said that the Jews that we would be able to bring will not have any votes, and that we will be dependent pretty much only on Arab votes. So we had to adapt the party to its potential voters base. We did end up having 2 Jewish candidates, not in realistic positions, in 8th and 10th positions, expecting that we would probably get 5 to 6 seats, no more than that. And we ran with an agenda of what we called equal integration. The idea was, how do we bring the Arab citizens to be, one, effective, to get integrated, but to get integrated in politics as equals to Jewish members of the Knesset, meaning not just representation in the Knesset, but also representation in the government, meaning in the decision-making apparatus, in the administration of the State of Israel, and not just in the representation body, where you actually only engage in debates, or you engage in speeches. You are able to maybe express your anger and frustration, but not have real impact. The real impact in Israel is if you get into the government. Not a single Arab political party has ever been invited to be part of Israel's government. And that's what we wanted to change. We thought that the time is ripe, and the time is ripe seemed to be in the Arab community. It's not ripe enough in the Jewish community. Now, we came in at a time where the frustration in the Arab community from political participation was very, very high. And the expectation was that it's going to take, there's going to be very low participation rate. Unfortunately, this expectation was materialized. About 45–46% of Arab citizens voted only, which is about 20% less of that of the Jewish community, leaving very little votes to be distributed among among parties that are promoting or interested in representing the Arab community or issues relating to the Arab community. With 45% turnout rate in the Arab community, you actually end up needing almost 30% of the Arab voters. While in the Jewish community, to pass the threshold, you need almost only about 3.5% or 3 3.75%. The formal number is 3.25%, but if you take if you take out the Arab community and you only look at the Jews, you need about 3.5% of the Jewish voters, and that gets you into the parliament. While in the Arab community, you need 30% of the voters. That mission seemed to be feasible at the beginning, We only had a 2.5-month campaign, and it was not good enough time to get organized. The idea was very appealing. We saw, and then when we decided to pull out, there were three numbers that helped us make that decision. One, there was somewhere around 11% of the Arab citizens were willing to vote for such a party. That is less than we need. That's about 20% of the Arab voters. But then there were 19% that were saying, we would have voted for you if we were convinced that you will pass that threshold. So they didn't want to burn their vote by voting to a party that doesn't have the chances to get into the parliament. But interestingly enough, was also 24% were saying that this is the right idea. This is what Arab politics should be like, but we don't know the people. They know myself, Mohammed, but they don't know number 2, 3, 4, 5. We had too many anonymous individuals, people that come from social economic background, not from political or media background. So the name recognition was also not there to be attractive enough. So the idea was strong, important, felt in the right idea, but it seems that the timing wasn't sufficient to get organized for it.
Well, it looks like you might have another chance. I'm not sure. I'm sorry if people are still waking up here on the East Coast or even on the West Coast. There was a lot of math in that first answer for a Sunday morning, but I appreciate the specificity. And you mentioned in your answer, the fact that no Arab lawmakers have ever been part of an Israeli coalition. And this has been an increasing question, issue, debate, possibility during this kind of endless election cycle. I know that the Israel Democracy Institute has continuously polled on the question of how basically Israeli Jews feel about the participation or possibility of, and there's some different scenarios of Arabs supporting a government from the outside, and it's a very complicated system there. But I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the broader dynamic of Arab Israeli politicians and voters in the current election and in the negotiations over the coalition, because we had a little bit of a twist this time with Mansour Abbas and his United Arab Party joining Netanyahu, essentially supporting Netanyahu, and the joint list. It's a little confusing, united, joint, whatever, but the joint list firmly on the left and getting much smaller this time. You talked about your own attempt to kind of bridge those divides. Tell me how it looks for you now, back in the role of analyst on watching what's happening. What are the chances of either of the Arab groups becoming part of a coalition? There's been a lot of pretty ugly talk from the right about not joining with them, and more broadly, what do you think is going to happen? Are we just going to go back to a fifth election, or what's going to happen? So,
well, let me start with your last question. Yes, we're closer to fifth elections than any other scenario, but the second scenario is that Benjamin Netanyahu will be able to form a government, and if he forms a government, it seems that he's going to be very dependent on Mansour Abbas. At least he's waiving this ticket for the first time in Israel's history, that the right wing is waiving the feasibility of forming a government with an Arab political party. This party specifically is the Islamic movement. I mean, the name United Arab List is covering behind it the Islamic movement, which is seen. I mean, this is the pragmatic side of the Islamic movement. The Islamic movement split over the issue of participating in the Israeli elections or not, boycotting Israeli elections in 1996. The southern wing was the wing that is now the United Arab List. The northern wing was headed by Sheikh Raed Salah. They boycott Israeli elections because they see participation as recognition of the Jewish state of Israel, and they don't want that to be on their record, because when you sign in as a political party, you need to accept Israel's definition as Jewish and democratic state. That's the law in Israel. Otherwise, you're not allowed to be to run to the Knesset, and then you need also to swear the oath of allegiance to the state of Israel, over which there was also a little scandal last week, because four members of the Arab parties refused to declare that allegiance in the ceremonial event starting the last elections. Now, when we talk about the the United Arab List and about their possibility of going together with Benjamin Netanyahu, they're actually identifying a need within the Israeli right wing, which seemed to have exhausted its capacity to get in more support to Benjamin Netanyahu from the Jewish community. So they're seeking out a new pool of voters and members of the Knesset from the Arab community. They tried initially to appeal for Arab voters to vote directly to the Likud. That didn't work much. They were expecting somewhere about 3 to 4 seats to come to the Likud from the Arab community. And we saw all the visits of Benjamin Netanyahu to Nazareth and to some other towns, making promises, basically promising to eliminate discrimination almost completely, and trying to say that the future Israeli government is going to be very attentive to the social economic needs of the Arab citizens. And the Islamic movement, the United Arab List, played along with him. In the last 2-3 days, the Likud pulled out from their strategy to recruit Arab votes and directed most of their votes to the United Arab List, to the Islamic movement, because they wanted to help them pass the threshold, which actually worked. The Likud ended up getting only 22,000 Arab votes, which were about 60% of his seat, not reaching nearly the 3 to 4 seats that they were expecting. Now, Mansour Abbas tries to justify this by saying the Arab citizens in Israel need to have only social economic agenda and not to have a political or agenda or regional agenda, meaning deal with the Palestinian issue, for example, or support the Palestinians in their quest for statehood, even if it's just rhetoric. There isn't much real support of the Arab community for the Palestinian case, more than actual rhetoric by some speeches in the Knesset. And what Mansour Abbas is saying, this rhetoric is used to delegitimize the Arab members of the Knesset in their ability or in their effort to try to generate partnerships with government agencies or with the Prime Minister's office to be able to get social economic issues, specifically focusing on 4 issues. And when polled, the Arab community is asked the question, what do you want from your members of the Knesset? They state 4 things which get 91% of the support of the Arab community. Number 1 is to solve the issue of crime. Crime is very high in the Arab community. It's almost 4 times more than that of the Jewish community per capita. Second, the problem of employment. The unemployment rate in the Arab community is almost 3 times the national average. Third is the problem of housing. There's not enough zoning plans to permit legal housing and legal construction. The Arab citizens have jurisdiction, or Arab towns have jurisdiction on less than 3% of the lands of the state of Israel, while being 21% of the population. And the 4th issue is education. There's a great appetite in the Arab community for education, realizing that education is the ladder over which the Arab community wants to go through social and economic mobility. We're not talking about lazy population. We're talking about population that wants to work, but wants also to have good jobs and not just any jobs. And good jobs you can get through education. So the joint list doesn't have differences on the issues of the topics. What they have the difference is with whom to partner. And
Right.
they can't see with the right wing as any partner, and they have failed to create a proper relations with the center-left parties to be able to create some kind of strategic alliance, which can be translated into some kind of a government, as it was in the only hit part of history between 1992 to 1996 during the Rabin government. Arab parties were not part of the government, but they provided him what was called the safety net arrangement, meaning voting for him for confidence vote in exchange for social economic issues. That arrangement worked for 4 years. The results of it were fantastic. And now in history, we refer to that period as the golden ages of the Arab citizens in Israel.
I mean, it's interesting, Mohammed, when you talk about the issues that the Arab citizens care most about in the elections, it brings up this other problem with the Israeli system, which is that there's no local representation of anybody, and that therefore all politics is nationalized. And so
Correct.
all those issues with the save, really education too, are essentially constituent service issues that in our system, we tend to ask pressure our local represent. We have a little bit of a distinction between sort of that local services for things like crime versus big picture policies for foreign policy, et cetera. And all that gets kind of amalgamated in Israeli politics because there's never been any district representation. You mentioned something when you were talking before about the allegiance question and about just the whole question of Israel's status as a Jewish state. And I thought of one of the really interesting articles about you and your campaign was this one written about you and Yossi Klein Halevi. And I know you know each other from your work together at the Hartman Institute. And Yossi is one of my very favorite Israeli thinkers and analysts, and the author of the wonderful book Like Dreamers, as well as his more recent Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. And I think he talked in that article about your acknowledgement that Israel is the Jewish state, the nation state of the Jewish people, the Jewish homeland, and that in exchange, what your expectation is that Israeli Jews will acknowledge that it's a democracy and that it's a democratic state in which the Arab minority, has rights and has the right to equality. And that is this sticking point that has been such a problem. I mean, first, I remember back when I was there, 2013, during the Kerry talks with the Palestinians, between the Israelis, when Netanyahu declared that recognition of the Jewish state would be a bigger priority than it had ever been before. The Palestinians refused to acknowledge that. And then after that, of course, Netanyahu pushed forward the nation state law that forced the choice to some extent between Israel as a Jewish state and as a democratic one. I'm sure everybody on this call really believes that Israel is both, should be both. And I'd just love you to talk about, how you came to be in a place where you are ready to say, yes, it's a Jewish state, but it must also be a democracy, and how you think those two things can work together, how you believe that can actually work itself out, not in the way of the nation state law that forces people to choose, but in the intent of the Declaration of Independence.
Well, Jody, let me just correct at least my perspective on this issue.
Sure.
I don't believe Israel can allow itself just to be a Jewish state without being a democratic state. So it's a symbiotic relationship from my perspective. I cannot recognize Israel as a Jewish state if it's not a democratic state in the same breath. It's without a but. It has to be a symbiotic relationship. I recognize Israel as Jewish and democratic, as expressed in a number of laws. One is the law of elections. By the way, not a single party can run to the Knesset if it doesn't accept that. So even Balad, even the Islamic movement, even Hadash have to accept it. And even also the Zionist religious party, they have to accept the democratic nature of the state. But they actually do it as lip service, and they do not express it as a real belief. Well, I express it as a real belief. I express it as a real belief, and I dare to put it and say it in a way that tells the public, the Arab community, the real story. Actually, before presenting this idea, we did a poll, and more than 80% of Arab citizens accept Israel's definition as Jewish and democratic state. To be exact, 82% accept this definition. And it's not as long as that Jewishness and democracy are of equal value without hierarchy.
Sorry to interrupt you, but what was the percentage in that poll of Israeli Jews who accepted the symbiotic relationship, as you said?
We didn't check it. We checked only for our potential voters.
Sorry, okay.
And it was 82%, as long as it is two equal values,
right? Not
one coming with some kind of hierarchy. And that's exactly, for example, what the nation state law tries to do is it's putting hierarchy. It's putting the Jewish nature above the democratic nature of the state of Israel. Basically, making me second-class citizen in Israel, not just de facto, but also de jure, legally. And that kind of a Jewish state, I'm not willing to accept. So if the Jewish state means accepting the nation state law, which puts Arab citizens or non-Jewish citizens in the country as secondary citizens, as simply residents of the country, I'm not willing to accept that. And specifically, from my point of view, I'm an indigenous citizen of the state. I didn't immigrate to Israel. Israel immigrated to me. It needs to find a way to learn how to live with me, and not only me learning how to live with it. That comes usually in many of the discussions that we do at the center I work for, at Givat Haviva Center. We run those discussions, and unfortunately, most of the Israeli Jewish kids that come for the workshops, they think Arab citizens have immigrated to the country, and as a result, they have to simply completely eliminate any identity affiliation and simply find a way to fit in. So it's not the case. Maybe immigrants need to make an extra effort to fit in a state, but in the United States, for example, when the U.S. was formed, it had to create also space for Native Americans to maintain some kind of identity symbols and identity, and they have also collective rights. So the issue of Jewish and democratic for me is symbiotic relationship. I do recognize the right of the Jewish people for self-determination through having a state that serves their national interest, parallel to the need for a Palestinian state, Palestinian nation state, to serve the Palestinian national interest. Now, being an indigenous citizen, that is, my family has lived in the same village, I'm 27th generation. For me, homeland starts here, right where I am right now, in the lot that I live in, because we have a well that was dug here about 400 years ago by one of my great-grandfathers. For me, this is homeland. Homeland is not a flag, it's not a national anthem, it's this well that we had water from it for 400 years. It's the graveyard, which is about 40 yards away from my house, and that's where my 26 generations are buried. It's the 64 olive trees that I inherited from my grandfather. It's a different concept of belonging and different sense of homeland. So yes, I do know, and I'm comfortable with knowing that I live in my homeland called the State of Israel. The question, do I live in my country? So when Israel defines itself as only as a Jewish state, it says to me, I'm not your country. So the fault is not in me. The fault is in the way the state defines itself. And the correction needs to be in the way the state defines itself. I have no problem with Israel being a Jewish state, but it cannot stop there. It has to be also the state of its citizens. It's not to say Israel needs to be the state of its citizens does not eliminate the fact that Israel can also be the state of the Jewish people. That's a process of maturity that the Jewish majority in Israel has to go through to understand that they are a majority, and a majority has the duty to create space for the minorities, and that's where the Jews are continuing to behave in Israel with a mentality of a minority and not the mentality of a majority. They're taking zero responsibility to create political and legitimacy space for non-Jewish citizens. Now, the duty on the minority is to accept the fact that there's also a majority that has collective rights. I cannot only come and claim for collective rights for the minority without recognizing the rights of the majority, the collective rights of the majority as well. Now there are enough laws that protect the rights of the majority in Israel, not enough laws, if at all, that protect the rights of the minority in Israel. You are on mute.
There's always got to be one, right? Where I stay on mute. Just trying to get my kids' background noise not to share with all of our hundreds of people in the audience. Anyway, thank you. You led me perfectly into my next question, which really is about a little more personally about the experience of living with dual identities. You as you said, your family has been in that place in Ixal for, I think, 800 years, 27 generations. It's kind of unfathomable.
Kids are 28.
You're 28th now, your kids, right? And for us in America, with all of our mobility, it's a little hard to even get our minds around that. And you've described yourself as a child of dual identities. And you've also said that you see that as an asset, not as a burden, which is really beautiful and inspiring after so much kind of ugliness around some of the issues there. I'm interested in when you feel your own two identities most in conflict or most in tension, and how you work through that kind of individually. And I'm also going to add a question from one of our audience members, Sarah, I think it's Nows or Knaus. She says, the US has done a horrible job giving space, identity, and rights to our indigenous communities. She asks if Israel has been even worse than we have been to the Native Americans. So I'd love you to talk a little personally about that dual identity and how you live it every day, and where you see the tensions, and maybe for yourself, for your kids, and then whatever you have to say about us versus you.
You know, most people think about identity as a singular item. You know, my identity is, you know, Palestinian or Jewish or things like that. And actually, and this is something we teach at Givat Haviva, identity is actually circles. You know, one circle envelops the other, and sometimes it's two circles that go, you know, that connect with each other. When I think about my Palestinianhood, for example, or my Arab identity, it's not the same Arab identity as someone that lives in Hebron or in Jenin or in Amman or in the Emirates. Our Arab and Palestinian identity is very local. It has, you know, and it's different. So maybe we agree on 80 or 90% of the identity components of the Arab or the Palestinian identity. For example, I'm a Palestinian, but I will not move to live in a Palestinian state. So I don't see my future in a future Palestinian state, because I know that realistically speaking, a future Palestinian state will be in the West Bank and Gaza. But I'm hoping, yeah, hopefully. But I'm home.
But as you said before, your home is with the well and the graveyard, and
so I don't need to move to future. I don't need to move to Ramallah to feel that I'm in my homeland. And so maybe that makes me 80% Palestinian, because I'm not going to be part of the future Palestinian project. In Israel, as long as Israel defines itself as the state of the Jewish people, well, and I'm not that part of that, then the question is, how much Israeli am I? So maybe I'm 80% Palestinian, 80% Israeli. It makes me 160%. So it's not deficit. You know, in the past, we used to think about this maybe as a deficit. I have a deficit in my Israeli identity. I have a deficit in my Palestinian identity. But if you combine them, actually, it's an asset. It's a capacity that no other Israeli has. It's a capacity to be able to live the Israeli potential of 100%, but maybe exercising it today at 80%, but also living the capacity of Palestinian and Arab at 80%, with the potential of being able to exercise that more. I mean, if I move to the Emirates tomorrow, it probably take me a year or two to get adapted. To an Israeli Jew, it's probably going to take them a lifetime to get adapted. I sent my son to study for high school in Jordan. He went to school, a high school there, and Royal Crown Prince was his classmate, and a few other kids from all over the Arab world. His WhatsApp and Instagram friends list goes through the whole Middle East of first friends of that he lived with in the dorms. He played in soccer with them. He studied with them for 4 years. It's a capacity no other Israeli can do. Only an Arab citizen can swim in the Arab Ocean around us, and not a single Arab from Arab countries can one listen to the news at 8 p.m. in Israel and understand and sense and feel Israeli politics, Israeli culture, and go to maybe a play in the theater, in Israeli theater, and be able to also absorb the Israeliness and not only accept the Israeliness, but also contribute and change it. We started by contributing curses and then hummus and falafel. Now we're contributing the dean of the law school at Hebrew University, the dean of nanotechnology at the Technion, the director of Nahariya Hospital. So it's our contribution to the Israeli culture and identity and business fabric has climbed up to levels that are taking us out of being, the poor Arabs that are the construction workers and the garbage collectors. If you go to Super Farm, one of the pharmacies chains in Israel, 55% of the pharmacists in Israel are Arab, 35% of the dentists, 33% of the nurses, 23% of the doctors. We are creating a new, at least Israel, the medical Israel is not Jewish. The medical Israel, more than a third of it is Arab. If you go to consume medical services in Israel, you'll find in Israel you do not know if you only live in Kiryat Gat or you only live in Nahariya and you're used to that traditional Arab service providers. Suddenly, they control your life in a hospital. They are contributing to your well-being in a way that you look up at them and you don't look down at them. One of the things that, the question of Sarah, I believe, the question of Sarah, I think it's hard to compare. I mean, I spent a year in 2016 in Europe looking at national minorities. I studied 23 different cases of officially recognized national minorities. Spent almost 2 weeks with every group there. There's no one size fits all. Every nation found a different relationship with its minority. But the one thing that worked was when the majority group granted the minority group collective status, meaning giving it the right to protect its identity, to give it the dignity to maintain its culture, its language, its religion. Those that choose to live separately can live separately, but those that choose to integrate into the larger pool, the larger society, it was open stage. In the US, I think it was creating cages and less of allowing people to integrate. In Israel, we have this kind of a mix. So many Arab villages are closed without capacity of growing and maybe connecting with nearby Jewish towns. That was part of the military administration period in 1948 until 1966, where the Israeli government policy was called containment, to contain the Arab citizens in their own villages. This is breaking apart now dramatically. There are more and more Arab citizens that are moving to live in nearby Jewish towns out of necessity because there's no ability to build homes in Arab villages. So people are getting creative. Fine. So we'll move to the nearby Jewish town. So you go to Nofa Galil, which used to be Natsat Elite. Nofa Galil was built near Nazareth as a Jewish town. Today, it has more than 35% Arab population. You go to Harish, it was built to be a Jewish town. Today, it has 12% Arab population. And that's the case in many towns neighboring Arab communities. It's changing by the power of, or by the dynamics of individuals, not the dynamics of government policy. Government policy, unfortunately, is failing to catch up the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is that Jews and Arabs are learning to live together.
I think it's really interesting, Mohammed, to hear you talk about dual identity, because I think the time is coming. I mean, here we are just increasingly talking about mixed identities and the fluidity of identity, whether that be gender identity, whether it be understanding that we have many Jews of color in our communities, whether it be in the Reform movement. So many of the leaders of our synagogue temple near Tamid are mixed families with one, Jewish, non-Jewish parents raising Jewish children. So I think this question of in, out, balancing identity is, we're getting to understand more of its complexity, and maybe that bodes well for the future there too. A couple of people have asked things related to COVID, and I wanted to ask you about that. Before the call, we let the guests in, you mentioned that something like 60 or 65% of your town is vaccinated or has at least one shot, I think, which is, I think, lower than the broad Israeli average, but of course higher than many places here and most places around the world. there's been Arab communities in general have lagged behind Jewish ones in Israel, but there's been a significant government push to build up vaccination there. And yet there's been a big debate over what Israel's role should be in helping to vaccinate Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you see that, whether Arab Israelis have been active in pressuring the government to vaccinate Palestinians in the territories, and how you see that in relationship to your own role or the role of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, Arab Israelis, in advocating really for Palestinian rights and for a future Palestinian state. You mentioned that you're not going to move there, but is it part of your politics to push for Palestinian nationalism, et cetera? So maybe talk about COVID first, and then you can broaden.
I mean, first of all, I would start by saying thank you, COVID. I mean, this virus has done significant good to the Arab citizens, not from the medical point of view, but from being able to expose the medical capacity of the Arab employees in the medical field. Arab doctors, we are, as I said earlier, we have higher percentage in the medical industry than our proportionate rate in society. And as a result, many Israeli Jews were exposed to this capacity that the Arab citizens are bringing, fighting for the first time an enemy of all Israelis. It's not, you know, the state of Israel dealt with COVID as a war. You know, we were at war situation, and many of the soldiers and the commanders were Arab in this war, which is a situation that didn't happen before. Many Arab doctors became icons of heroism. Many photos of Arab and Jewish medical staff praying together, one praying for Allah and one praying for Elohim. Happens to be the same, but with different kind of ceremony. And this happened many, many times. And these kind of videos became very viral. Israel was celebrating this moment of unity around this common enemy. So in a sense, COVID did create that kind of a situation, but it had also its negative part. The negative elements of it, it showed how weak the Arab community is from infrastructure perspective, where the capacity of our municipalities was very much lower than that of the Jewish municipalities, where the government subsidies for the municipalities differed dramatically, and where discrimination in subsidies during crisis period was also differentiated, where Jewish towns were getting much, much more than Arab towns. And the Israeli media and the press were, for the first time, highlighting this issue. How come we expect wonders from those Arab medical staff in hospitals, and when they go home, garbage is not collected in their neighborhoods? Their neighborhoods are not safe enough. That dichotomy became very, very strong and very obvious because Israeli Jewish audience were more tolerant to hear the voice of an Arab doctor than the voice of an Arab politician or the voice of an Arab academic personality that criticizes discrimination. A doctor that provides you, you're willing to be more attentive and listening, you know, accepting to their perspective. Today, the Arab community is beginning to catch up, at least from the health perspective. I think because of that pressure that I mentioned, because of the high expectations from the government to catch up on this issue. And I must say the media played an incredible role in the last year, much, much more than it played in the previous 71 years of the life of the state of Israel, in legitimizing the presence of Arab professionals, medical professionals in mainstream media in prime time broadcast period. And it did contribute something. Now, with the problem is not over yet. And I wrote an article in March last year when COVID was started, and I said, wait for the second wave. And the second wave, I expected it already in March to actually start in the Arab community because there was a shortage of government information that is provided in Arabic. Most of the information was provided only in Hebrew and not in Arabic, where there was also lack of capacity of the Arab community, doesn't have enough emergency staff. We're not experienced in managing emergency. There was also the problem of trust between some of the government agencies with the Arab community, such as the police or the military when they came in. The lack of trust slowed down the process of dealing with the problem of COVID, but time worked much, much faster. You know, as I said, 1 year of crisis closed gaps of maybe 70 years, but not completely. The gaps are still present and not solved completely. On the second issue of the Palestinian issue, you know, the massive majority of Arab citizens, when asked, they do define themselves as Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's not something that Israeli Jews like to hear. They prefer the term Arab citizens of Israel, which is considered to be more neutral term. It's not, you know, most Israeli Jews, the minute you say Palestinian, it's like putting your finger in their eyes. They relate to the term Palestinian as an enemy identity, which is not the way Arab citizens actually view it. I mean, when I say I'm a Palestinian, I'm not saying it for the Jews to hear it. I'm saying it for me to absorb it. It's my comfort zone where I can breathe and say, now I'm comfortable in saying, yes, I'm a Palestinian. Yes, I'm an Israeli. That makes me express who I am. But many refrain from using the term Palestinian when they speak to the Jews out of fear of what kind of reaction they'll get, because most Jews see the term Palestinian as enemy and as an enemy term and not legitimized enough term in the public sphere. But yet, when is that really expressed? It's expressed maybe a couple of times a year. I would say out of 365 years in the year, 363 we are Israelis. But on the day of the Nakba, which is Israel's Independence Day, we make a point out of saying we're Palestinian, we're part of the Palestinian people. And on another day, which is commemorating October 2000, the killing of Arab citizens by the Israeli police, we also make demonstrations and we also assert our Palestinian identity. In day-to-day, our Palestinianhood is expressed in charity, pretty much exactly as how many Jews in America express their allegiance to Israel, in charity. We do not have the same capacity as the American Jewish community, but comparing our economic status versus the Palestinians in the West Bank, there's a serious gap. So with 150 shekels, you can support an orphan in the West Bank. And about 35,000 Arab families support 35,000 orphans in the West Bank. With the, 2,000 shekels covers the tuition of a Palestinian student to study at university in Geneva. In Israel, you pay 13,000 shekels to cover tuition. So the fact that we have that kind of an economic gap allows us to express our Palestinianhood in charity towards the Palestinians. In every Friday afternoon after the Friday prayer, trucks go around collecting rice and food and sometimes money to send and medicine to send to Palestinian villages and families. Our Palestinian, our support for Palestinian statehood is also clear, although it's not one of the top 4 issues in the priority, but those are issues that are first choice. If you ask people for what's your second choice, an expectation from your member of the Knesset, 56% say we want them to support the Palestinian issue. So it comes in as a second choice. It's high enough, but how are you willing to be engaged in the Palestinian struggle for statehood? Then people start drawing red lines. So, for example,
Mohammed, I'm realizing that we have only about 10 minutes left. So I want to.
The main red line that we draw is that we're not willing to import intifada-like methods, meaning violence, in as it happens in the West Bank, we're not willing to bring it, import it in Israel, because this will harm our relationship with the Jewish population. We want Israel to negotiate this divorce agreement with the Palestinians, but we want to negotiate our marriage agreement with the state of Israel. So
Yeah.
we want a split there, but we want unity inside the state of Israel.
I'm really glad you walked through why and how you see the term Palestinian citizen of Israel, because as a language person, I've been using that term a lot, but it's always interesting how different people react to it. I thought you explained it really beautifully. Rabbi Katz is going to ask a question, and then I'll ask some from the audience. And again, we only have about 10 minutes, so we'll try to keep our answers a little shorter.
So thank you. This has been an incredible conversation. And by the way, in the chat, you can see that if you want more information about any of the work that you do, it's in the chat right now. But I noticed you were talking about multiple hats that you wear, and kind of Israeli hat, Palestinian hat. I was noticing as I was looking at your bio before that you also wear a couple different hats when it comes to public intellectual, activist, nonprofit leader, and aspiring politician. And I'm curious, in terms of civil society work, in terms of building the Israel that you want to see, how do you see each of those different roles being part of the conversation? Because a public intellectual is very important, but plays a very different role, let's say, than an activist does. And you dwell in all of those different worlds.
Thank you, Rabbi Katz. Actually, this is a question that I faced 21 years ago. In August 2000, I joined Givat Haviva. I was in mainstream politics. I was campaign manager. I was working in the Knesset as faction manager of one of the largest Arab political party at the time. And I decided to leave the political arena and basically go 2 floors down. Leave the national politics, leave the bureaucratic politics, and go to civil society, where I feel what is lacking is bottom-up work and not only top-down. Top-down, there are the political parties that are doing it. I don't think with enough success, but I felt there was enough momentum going on there, and I didn't want to waste my energy being a politician. And that's why I did knock the door of Givat Haviva at the time, and I said, "Hey guys, I want to work for you." They said fine, so I started working 3 days a week, and now I'm working 12 days a week. But the idea is that what's important is really to create what I call those islands of success. I think if we want to continue focusing on the top down, trying and expecting and waiting for the government to come and solve the problems, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because there are a lot of Israeli politics is made out of so many small fragments, and the political system in Israel is so controlled by small political parties that it is very difficult. It takes the system hostage by small groups. Where I did feel, and I do feel, that you're able to create differences is in 2 places. One in civil society organizations, and if you go to our website, the Givat Haviva website, you'll see a number of projects there. But specifically, how civil society can engage with government. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the main problems that we face is the segregated educational system. And one of the ideas I came up with, if we can't bus children as you do in America, that's the decision of the busing in 1960s, let's start busing teachers. Bring Jewish teachers in Arab schools and Arab teachers in Jewish schools. I started with this project in 2005 with 6 teachers only. Today, there's close to 1,300 teachers who are cross-sector teachers. It is changing the Israeli educational system dramatically. More than 17-18% of the Israeli educational system today has this cross-sector teacher present in the life, an Arab teacher in the life of a Jewish kid, a Jewish teacher in the life of an Arab kid. It is changing the basic conceptions of those kids of who the other is. And I think politics needs to reflect the reality on the ground. So and that's why I thought to come back into politics now, because I see that maybe there's enough volume of good relations that can be represented in parliament. And unfortunately, I don't, we weren't able to organize it, but that volume of cross-sector interdependency that is being formed in Israel needs to also get its political representation. So the reason, Rabbi Katz, I'm moving in both directions is because of my belief that it has to be dual strategy, bottom up at the same time, and this is what you can do every day. I mean, I come home satisfied every day because we know that we're able to get one more Arab kid to study high tech. And if an Arab kid studies high tech, one, he's going to succeed as an individual. The Arab community is going to benefit from him because if you work in high tech, you get 3 times the average wage, and that helps to solve problems of poverty in the Arab community. But that person is also helping Israeli larger economy. He's helping Israeli larger society, where he's going to get respect and dignity for himself, but also for his community. And that alone, that one case every day, is sufficient for me to go and sleep in comfort that day. I'm not sure how politicians, if they can get that kind of comfort, because they're always in this kind of combating mood, and we are in production mode. We're in the business of producing success stories every single day in civil society, and that's what I pride myself in.
I love what you said about the teachers, Mohammed. I think that's so important. I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing I was always talking about was missing from society there. So I'm so glad to hear that program is growing. We are basically out of time, and I'm sorry because we do have a lot of good questions.
You are out of time, not me.
We have a lot of good questions from the audience about politics, and thank you for all of that. I'm going to ask one last question that's a little bit more of a personal nature, because I see we're also losing some people. I know it's Sunday, people have things to do. I want to once again thank Larry Westreich for helping us put this together, and Doron from Givat Haviva, and Rabbi Katz, of course, for hosting this. We will let you all share the video with all of you, as well as I said earlier, a discount subscription to the Forward. I hope you'll sign up for our free newsletters and subscribe or support us. We are reader supported and independent. And I just really appreciate all of you coming and joining us for this great conversation. Mohammed, one of the most intriguing things about you personally really is your family's history in the place. And you live in a village called Iksal, I believe. It's like 13,000 people. I think half of them are related to you, is what I hear, 6,500 people. So, and your family has been there for 27 generations, 28 generations. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about what it is like to live in the same village as your ancestors have for 800 years, to live in a place where you are related to half the town, and you have 4 children, the 28th generation of this Israeli, Arab, Palestinian, Israeli family, Palestinian family, obviously back to 800 years. And I'm just interested in what you think about their future identities and politics, and what you imagine for them, for that 28th generation of your family, as you look ahead.
Well, it's more complicated than what you describe also, because my wife is from East Jerusalem, and she has 2 sisters that live in Ramallah, and 1 sister that lives in Bethlehem in the West Bank. So when I speak about my identity, and when I speak about my family identity, it's beyond just the village. You know, it stretches over inside Palestinian towns, where the well-being of the Palestinians has family meaning to me. It's not just the Palestinians. It's my immediate family. It's the cousins of my children that they talk to every single day, and they hear the issues and the stories. But in a way, all my 4 kids are at university. My son is doing his MBA and works for one of the big pharmaceutical companies in Israel in management. My older daughter is doing her PhD in genetics at the Technion. Second daughter is studying first-year dentistry, and the last daughter is pre-academic year at Haifa University. We're busy building a future. We are busy deepening our capacity and maximizing our capacity to succeed. We're not counting on Israel or the Jews or the Arab world to come and help us. We're counting on our own self. I think that, and we're not unique actually. I think we are in my extended family and in the community in general. We know that social economic mobility starts in your brain. Make it work extra time, and you'll get extraordinary results. And which I would call it the beginning of internalizing the status of a minority. I mean, until a few years ago, we used to think we are Arabs, part of the regional majority. And after the Oslo agreements, which basically said to us, you're going to continue to be Israelis, we started realizing that we're going to continue to be minority. And to be a minority, it's not enough to be able to complain and enough to be able to express your anger and frustration. You need to move on to a situation where you build your own brain muscle and not just physical muscle to work in construction. To build your brain muscle so that you're able to break through in Israeli society. So we're not waiting for anyone. We're not waiting for the government to be nice to us. We're not waiting for the Arab world to finally look at us and think of us as the leftovers of the Palestinians and the leftovers of the Arab world. We know that we are on our own. We do take care of our own self also. Yes, we are in my village. It's 15,000, not 13,000, 15,000 people. 47% poverty rate. You don't have a single person sleeping in the street. And I can promise you, not a single person goes to sleep hungry. And that's without government being involved. That's because of our family system, because of our communal system. It operates in a way that maybe we're not able to provide them with new shirts. But I know before I throw my shirt, which I don't need anymore, we clean it, we iron it, we put it in a plastic bag, we put it on the shelf until one of the relatives, the poor relatives, comes in and we say, aha, I have a shirt for you, which would be your size. And the same thing with they need a scholarship or something like that. People are not hungry, although they are very poor, but they're not hungry. So that system of internal dependency on each other, in a way, it's keeping us a bit down as a collective. So you could make money, but you have many dependents, and the dependents are not your immediate children. Sometimes they are your nephews or the children of your cousin or the children of someone in the neighborhood. The wealth that you bring as an individual or the income you bring gets distributed to many mouths and many shoulders that you need to cover. But at least we're maintaining some level of dignity. This is being broken, unfortunately, so it is a bit scary that the community is beginning to grow, and in a way we're imploding because of the difficulties of housing. There's no housing capacity where the community is able to develop in new housing projects. So it's one floor above the other, and that creates problems of parking and where you put the garbage cans, and we don't have the infrastructure to sustain a chaotic kind of construction. So it's creating a lot of social problems that we didn't have before as a rural community. It's villages that are becoming towns on the same infrastructure, and that's creating a lot of social problems. And it allows also the emergence of antisocial behavior, especially flourishing with the lack of the state. The state is not present where you need it. It's not present in zoning plans. It's not present in handling poverty. It's not present in policing. And that makes our life much, much more difficult. So my kids who are creating a lot of capacity, my daughter who was doing her PhD in genetics, she was offered to do her PhD at the Broad Institute in Harvard, but she chose to do it here because she thinks that this would be better for her career in Israel, to do her PhD in an Israeli university then do her post-doctoral degree in the US. But in order to guarantee a job in Israel, she wanted to do her PhD in the best Israeli university. So super achieving is our motto. Don't be satisfied with the opportunities, create more and more opportunities. Learn, study, care for yourself, and seek partnerships with those Jews that are willing and looking for partnership. I will end with a debate I had with a professor from Haifa University who used to claim that the Arab citizens are growing so much in numbers that they are becoming an explosion, a demographic bomb, he's called it. And that the growth rate of the Arab community is much higher than the growth rate of the Jewish community. By the way, this is an absolute lie. If you look at the actual numbers, the growth rate of the Jewish population is 3.2%. The growth rate of the Arab community is 3.1%. I mean, you're getting the help from the Haredi Jewish community. They still count as Jews from my perspective. But what's interesting is that an Arab woman with a university degree and a job has less children than even a Jewish woman with a university degree and a job. And I told that Professor Arnon Sofer, I told him instead of counting Arabs and calling them a demographic bomb, you can be generous and you can give a scholarship to an Arab woman, and she guarantees, one, to be creative and pay taxes, and second, to have less children. So you can, if you are so scared of the demographics, open your pocket. And I will end by saying, if you want an Israel that cares for both the Jewish and the Arab citizens, also open your pockets. We need a lot of help in this work to get one more kid into university, to get two more kids, one Arab and one Jewish kid, to get to learn and to know each other, to get one more Arab teacher in a Jewish school, to get one more Jewish teacher in an Arab school. It's a small business of one school, one classroom at a time. That's a change we're able to make every single day, and we promise we can make it. Maybe we can't change Israeli politics from the bottom up that quickly, but I can guarantee we can get one more teacher tomorrow if we get enough support.
Mohammed, thank you so much. It's really inspiring to hear you, and I hope that soon I'll be able to travel there and see what it's like in Ixal with you and meet your wonderful children. I'm going to let Rabbi Katz have the last word, but thanks everybody for being with us and for supporting the Forward and Temple Ner Tamid.
Yes. So again, thank you to the Forward. Thank you, Jody, for always doing such a wonderful job facilitating these conversations. Mohammed, thank you for your candor, for your warmth, and for the great information that you gave. Most of the chats went directly to me, so you couldn't see, but people are just pouring out their love for you and just how thankful they are. Thank you to Larry Westrike on our...
I'll come visit you in October. I'm planning a trip in October.
Oh, fabulous.
Good to know. Thank you to Larry Westrike, who on our end made this happen. And you've been seeing throughout the course of the talk, the website to Givat Haviva, which is constantly up. Daron has been pasting it in. And so feel free to go to it to learn more about it and the good work that it's doing. And finally, we've been recording today. So on Temple Ner Tamid's YouTube page, sometime before maybe noon on Tuesday, we'll make sure that that this is up, and we'll share it with Jody so she can make sure everybody else has it too. So with that, thank you very much to our speakers.
Thank you all. Thank you.